Welcome to the first episode of Let's Talk CIWEM. This is a brand new podcast series which will keep you right up to date with the current issues in the world of water and environmental management. We'll talk to key figures across our industry and take a deep dive into some of the biggest challenges and topics we're all facing at the moment. We're grateful to our series sponsor, Yorkshire Water, for helping us share these conversations and bring this podcast idea to life. I'm Niki Roach, I'm the president of CIWEM, and now apparently a podcast host. Everything is connected is the theme of my presidency, and I hope this series of podcasts helps us all explore the opportunities that thinking in a more connected way might create. Over the next 6 episodes, we'll step behind the glossy PowerPoints and hear the real stories about what people are actually doing now globally to address the big issues of climate change and adaptation, improving diversity and inclusion across our sector, and reducing our demand for water. Each episode, joining me to give their opinions, expert analysis, and generally keep me in check, will be a guest host. And to launch our series and to explore the theme of advocacy with me, I'm delighted to be joined by Barbara, Baroness Young of Old Scone. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you for inviting me along. I'm glad to be part of this.
You are very welcome. Is it your first time on a podcast?
I suspect it's not, when you've been around the block as long as I have, but I can't remember what the last one was I did.
Well, we'll try and make this one more memorable. Today we're going to be exploring the topic of advocacy, and when I asked Barbara where that theme had been prevalent in her career, it was clear immediately that we've got the right co-host for this episode. Barbara spent her entire career involved in advocacy, including 20 years in the thick of NHS policy and politics, and ultimately leading the professional body for NHS managers. She's led the RSPB and English Nature, was Chief Executive of the Environment Agency, and now chairs the Woodland Trust. And Barbara, you said the biggest shock was the first time someone lobbied you as a new peer, although you actually spend more time lobbying government and others in Parliament rather than being lobbied. So I am really looking forward to hearing your views on everything we've got coming up. First, we're going to give our 2-minute take on a few big news stories that are relevant to this theme of advocacy. Then our big interview this episode is with Rigg, the Corporate Affairs Director at Affinity Water, and Alastair Chisholm, the Director of Policy at CIWEM. I spoke to them a few days ago, and I'm particularly excited to share with you what they had to say about the importance of storytelling in advocacy.
If we can bring that practical experience base, as well as the kind of academic evidence, together with that really eye-catching, cute messaging that the NGOs do so well, it can be really, really powerful.
You can tell what people are thinking. They're not thinking about the science of air quality in their kids' lungs. They're thinking, I'm not going to get to enjoy that opportunity with my own kids. And that's how you connect emotionally with people. And that's what that air quality campaigning has been doing a really impressive job of.
Finally, we'll hear Barbara's reflections on that interview and her advice on delivering more effective advocacy across the water and environment sector. Right, let's take a look at a couple of the biggest stories around at the moment, certainly in the UK. And Barbara, I've been really interested in seeing both the UK Prime Minister's announcement about his 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, and then it's likely that the UK government, ahead of COP26 next year in Glasgow, are going to announce a carbon reduction target of about 68% by 2030. I guess I'm interested, particularly in your unique role as a peer. What are your reflections on the kind of UK government's approach to carbon reduction emissions, and where's the advocacy angle in all of this from your perspective?
I think there are a shed load of initiatives coming through at the moment. I mean, the feeling in Parliament is that we're kind of running around like mad, demented ferrets. But that does give a real opportunity for advocacy. I mean, if you think about it, it's not just the green recovery plans and the carbon targets, but there's things like nature recovery networks, the Climate for Nature Fund, the Environment Bill, the huge reform of land use in the agricultural reform area. And so there are lots of buses passing, and getting on one or two of them is going to be quite possible. But it does make for huge amounts of activity, and people have really got to be pretty focused, I think, to decide where they can have influence and then do that in depth. I think one of the things that's a problem when there's a lot of opportunity is you can get into scattergun approach if you're not careful.
Let's drop into our big interview for this week, I think, in that case then, and think a bit more about advocacy. I was really keen to talk to Jake and Al about this topic, in particular after hearing Jake speak about the importance of embracing politics rather than seeing it in a perhaps more negative light, and hearing a little of his experience working on some US election campaigns. Al spent his career advocating for the environment and working really closely with the government. And so we caught up a few days ago over Zoom. And I started off by asking Jake about why advocacy is even necessary in the water and environment sector.
I think in the water sector, as much if not more than almost every other sector out there, if you don't do at least good advocacy work, you're a bit like a ship's captain complaining about the sea around you. I mean, it's there and it's in the condition it's in. And I think particularly in the water industry, where it's so heavily regulated, where we have a social licence to operate, that we really, really engage heavily with democratic bodies, with government officials, and with regulators on a really regular basis.
Al, can I bring you in? I'd love to know, so from your perspective, obviously CIWEM is an independent body, so give me a sense of, I guess, in your role as Director of Policy, where advocacy fits into all of that.
I mean, obviously CIWEM is an environmental organisation, and water is a really integral component of that environment, and it's kind of like the canary in the coal mine often for environmental health. But I think advocacy and campaigning and political engagement is kind of synonymous with that group. It's got its roots in the tragedy of the commons, hasn't it? It's because the environment offers us so many effectively free services. It's those or cheap. It's those resources that are really readily available and help us build all the products that we consume, absorb the pollution that production creates. And those processes, which are absolutely central, they're fundamentally undervalued or not even valued at all by the kind of prevailing economic systems that our whole societies are built on. If they're not even being factored into that equation, you've got to get them onto the radar. So you're really reliant on very compelling evidence to say that, well, yeah, the system doesn't recognise this as being beneficial, but we're really telling you it's important.
Well, it's so interesting. Something you said really resonated with me is around the value, actually, and how do we give value to the services that we are afforded, in essence, by the environment. That's really powerful. It's definitely something I've been thinking about recently, is how do we help people value those things. I wonder if I can bring you in, Jake, in that case, because I'm really keen to, Al's raised some interesting points. How well are we doing as a sector?
I think as an environmental sector, some of the best advocacy work out there that's ever been done really has been done in the environmental sector. I think if you look back at some of the big EU directives, Water Framework Directive, Habitats Directive, etc., Climate Change Act in 2008, Montreal Protocol, fantastic bits of advocacy led to those, and there were really big sea changes. And sometimes you can read back through that legislation and think, how on earth did they get that to pass? Having said that, on the water side of things, there's the Water Framework Directive, but equally, I think we're really not particularly good at it. One of the key factors in that is that understanding really, really clearly what your objectives are and who your audience is and who influences that audience is key in any form of communication, but it's particularly key in advocacy work because the systems by which people make decisions are so complex in government. It's why out from the outside it just looks like a sort of faceless bureaucracy or mass. If you don't really listen really actively and deeply, you're not going to get anywhere. And they can remain nameless, but a former minister, well, who is a current minister in a different role, once said to me that they thought that the sector was tone deaf, and in terms of the water sector. And if I'm honest, it really struck a chord with me. And you see a lot of these issues that are coming to the fore now where you think we have been engaging with them for a long, long time, but have we been really, really listening?
It's really interesting to hear the perception. I think there's a real risk with any sector that you become a bit of an echo chamber and you only talk to yourselves. And certainly, I spent my career in the water sector and we have our own language, and things like regulatory frameworks only serve to exacerbate that, actually, because we've got a special way of doing things. Al, from your perspective, obviously Jake's just said that you've done a dreadful job over the course of your career because we're dreadful at advocacy work. I've got a wry smile. Let's talk about where we could have done better, maybe. I'm really keen to hear some good examples and what we think those magic ingredients are, but maybe let's start with where have we missed some opportunities? Where could we have gone faster? What could we have done better?
I mean, that's a really hard one to answer, because to be honest, if I knew the answer to it, I probably would have done it differently. But I think just picking up on what Jake said and knowing your audiences and having access to the right people to be able to make some of your arguments stick. We can be very, very familiar with a certain government department and be very aligned with what that government department might think and might want to achieve. And the obvious case in point in the kind of UK or English example are DEFRA, and that's not the ultimate audience that you're having to convince. DEFRA then has to go and convince the rest of government, Treasury, and that can be the point at which things really, get cut down. And look at climate change and the direction of travel that scientists have been saying we should be going in for a long, long time. The perennial criticism is that science community has not been good enough. Oh, if only that we could get these messages across much more effectively, much more compellingly. It's not all about hair shirt experience. You're not going to have to give up everything. There are some positive outcomes associated with this as well. We can build a greener, more, resilient future out of all of this, where we might all be happier and more prosperous.
Did you just say hair shirt, just so I can be really clear?
Yeah, have you never worn one?
What? What? I mean, it's saying a lot more about your fashion choices than it is mine.
Well, it's lockdown, Niki,
Amazing. I might get myself one of those. I didn't realise that was an option.
I'm banging on about storytelling, but hair shirts are obviously not a good story. We need to get a lot better at linking the evidence with the narrative, I think, and I think we are getting better.
Yeah, interesting. Stories are, I'm definitely reflecting on that a lot at the moment. Actually, stories is what makes the world go round, is what it feels like, actually. Right from when we're children, they're really powerful. I've wondered, Jake, whether I can almost pass the baton over to you in terms of picking that up as a thread. Any examples that you could share of where advocacy has worked, and maybe try and unpick a little bit for me why you think that might be, what some of the magic ingredients are from some of that? Yeah,
for sure. And just to defend, listeners won't be able to see Al's fashion choices, but he's looking very good. Not a hair shirt actually in sight, but I think it's a really powerful point. Storytelling is absolutely what makes the world go round, and I think there's an element of just really taking that step back and simplifying what we're talking about. I always laugh. I have a colleague, at least one doctorate in hydrogeology, knows everything there is to know, and he shows me and voluntary communities these charts, and they've got 8 different lines on them, all with different kind of wavelengths on these chart patterns. And he says what this clearly shows, and I'm always sitting at the back of the audience thinking, what I'm thinking about is actually, do you remember the Viennetta slices, those little desserts with the little wiggly lines in them? And I think that's all it's reminding me of, because it's 9 o'clock and it's a Tuesday night in a village hall, and I'm really hungry. And I've got a horrible feeling everyone else is sitting there thinking that and going, I have no idea what's happening. I always say it's not about getting more scientists per se into, say, Parliament or Congress. It's about getting everybody to think in a scientific way. I think the other key point in this is that, of course, you're not telling these stories in a really static space, in a vacuum. Other people are telling other stories about it, which is what's really, really obviously held back climate scientists from telling their story in their way. And that's about really picking the bits that are resonant to people and key voters now. What the traditional sort of oil lobby has done, particularly in the States, is really it's all about jobs, right? I mean, you could see that in the last presidential election, where in Virginia, in coal mining communities, people were right behind Trump, even if they'd already lost their job because their coal mine had shut down because it frankly wasn't economically viable anymore, and saying, well, it's not going to benefit me, but I want someone to champion me and my values. And that's where the story bit comes into kind of values. And this is the irony, because I look at the water sector and the environmental sector and think these are people with values that are second to none. I mean, I've never met people in an industry that so uniformly is met by people who are really driven by public purpose, by environmental concern. And yet, does the rest of the world know that? I don't think it knows it at all, really.
We're really grateful to our sponsor, Yorkshire Water, for making it possible to bring you this podcast series. If your organisation would like to find out more about sponsoring future episodes or series of Let's Talk WEM, just go to letstalkwem.ciwem.org to get all the information you need. A colleague of mine mentioned the other day that I was thinking about is whether COVID actually gives us an opportunity in terms of, and I don't mean that to be crass, taking obviously into account the awful circumstances it's presented for many people, but I suppose the opportunity around scientific literacy. You'll have people talking about an R number. I don't know, it's just something I was kind of mulling over. I don't know what you think really about that, guys, whether it's an opportunity or not.
I think it's really important that in advocacy work, you're nimble and you're able to mobilise around issues and make the most of opportunities that occur. So obviously, COVID isn't the kind of opportunity that anyone would want to have occurred, but it's definitely given oxygen to that whole green recovery agenda, to the health and well-being benefits of being able to get outside in the natural environment. And I think that, there's two strands. The look at the pace at which vaccines have been developed. I mean, that is absolute testament to scientific ingenuity and the way in which science can mobilise around a really, really urgent need. And it's a case of really trying to harness those kind of narratives for other beneficial causes as well. What we're seeing now is people are very, very good at very quickly mobilising coalitions of support. At a certain point in time, when it's going to be high up a political agenda, it may get the debating time in Parliament, and if you can really demonstrate that weight of support by a large community and a large constituency, then you can really make the most of those opportunities.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think that sort of seize the day piece is really, really key, and I think there's a really important window of opportunity here. I mean, most environmental regulation in the UK was driven by EU regulation up until this point, and put aside feelings about Brexit. I'm not going to go there, but for obvious reasons. But what this does do is it means that future environmental regulation is going to be debated at length in Parliament, and I think there's a real job for journalists in particular to get their head around that. I think it's too easy that these things get lost. Or they're seen just as purely as technical or technocratic issues. And actually they're not. They're really fundamental to the way we all live. I see that as a really good thing. I think there's a real opportunity and a real window of opportunity, particularly for organisations at the sort of front of that, like CIWEM.
If we think about the kind of what next then, so the people that might be listening to this may be working with organisations or within organisations that might be advocating or could be CIWEM members. I suppose it's what's the way forward for us?
I mean, from a CIWEM perspective, I think I can't do this pod without selling the positive traits of CIWEM. And I think, we've got some massive environmental NGOs globally and nationally, and they're incredibly good through their activities at getting the media limelight through direct action. But I think the niche that CIWEM, organisations at CIWEM offer is we've got these thousands of members who are practitioners who go out and do solutions on the ground, day in, day out. They know what's working. They can call out some of the perceived wisdoms that maybe aren't true. And if we can bring that practical experience base, as well as the kind of academic evidence, together with that really eye-catching, really cute messaging that the NGOs do so well, it can be really, really powerful. And I think just bringing those whole communities, building the biggest coalitions we can with the most diverse experience bases, is how you get that thrust and that cut through and do that storytelling in the most compelling way.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Al. And Jake, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I really wholeheartedly endorse that. I think working with other organisations, working a bit with the Tide as well, is really, really key on all of this. And frankly, I think this is something where we've got a huge opportunity. And then I think also just a bit of a plea for everybody to think about what politics really is. It's almost become a dirty word. So, I certainly know when I talk to colleagues, and I say, yeah, but the political thinking about this is this, and it's completely different. It might seem completely removed from it. Politics exists, and it's really, really important. It's for good or ill how we decide where to spend money, what our priorities are, how we should live. It's why we have elections. And I think the first step of that is to be aware of it and to think, I wonder what the political lens on this issue is. But I'd also just reiterate exactly what Alastair just said, completely right. If we can build bigger coalitions and better and more effective coalitions around these things, we can just look at what's happened in air quality in the last few years as people have come up with a really resonant message. I actually did a survey when I first joined Affinity Water about 20 months ago, and I got everyone to put their hands up and said who played football with their dads when they were younger in the front garden kind of thing, who kicked the ball around, and loads of people mainly men, but not exclusively men, put their hands up, hands shot up, and you could see on their faces, like, everybody remembering it and such a powerful emotion, and then saying, and so how many of you would do that now with your own kids if you thought that it would damage their lungs? And of course all the hands shoot down, and you can tell what people are thinking. They're not thinking about the science of air quality in their kids' lungs. They're thinking, I'm not going to get to enjoy that opportunity with my own kids. And that's how you connect emotionally with people, and that's what the air quality campaigning has been doing a really impressive job of. Of course, what it's also done is the really detailed work that Alastair was alluding to, that really good organisations like CIWEM do as well, which can't be ignored. That evidence base still needs to be there, but both things need to be there in tandem.
Oh, pulling both together is fascinating. The theme of my presidential year is everything is connected, and I want to test that out a little bit with you if you can humour me for a moment or two. So the next pod that we're recording is with Doncaster County Council and the Environment Agency, and we're going to be talking about flooding, and we're going to be talking about the 2019 severe winter flooding that happened here in Yorkshire, and exploring how local authorities and regulators worked together during an incident, but then actually have worked together following that incident. And then we're going to be chewing that over with Liam Foster, who's guest presenting with me, and Liam works in Christchurch in New Zealand, and actually, as we were chatting the other day, there are big floods in Napier happening at the moment. So that's where we're going next. That's the next conversation, and I guess I'm wondering, is everything connected, and is there a link from the conversations that we've just been having about advocacy work into conversations about flooding?
I mean, absolutely, and I think everything is very, very connected. And I think what is a change in US policy going to mean for world policy, a global policy really, on climate change? And in particular, it looks like President-elect Biden's administration is going to be doing a lot of work, for example, on water, and looking at making water climate resilient in the US. And the link between that then into the COP26 in Glasgow coming up, and then back to flooding, sea level rise and coastal change and coastal erosion. I mean, it seems a long way from Doncaster to the White House, but actually those links are incredibly strong.
Al?
I think it's really interesting over the last decade or so how the public perception of solutions around flooding has probably changed, and how that has connected into wider benefits. So back in 2013-14, when there was widespread flooding all over, and particularly around the Somerset levels, everyone was there was this huge kind of public and media outcry to dredge all the rivers because that's a solution, and that was where we did a good bit of work, really trying to myth bust that. And we set out this case, worked again with the NGO community, saying no, you need a whole catchment approach too. And then last winter, when there was all the flooding, you hear the kind of interviews, the vox pops that are on the TV around solutions. And yeah, sure, people want higher flood defences, but they're also calling for more tree planting in upper catchments. Slowing the flow has become part of the language that the public actually understand. Well, certainly in those kind of communities that are at flood risk, they understand it, they want it. These connections into the wider thing, I think that is becoming much more kind of common parlance at the moment, and that's great to see.
Thanks, Al. Slow the flow actually is a really good example, I think, isn't it, of something that's hydrological concept, but actually has become something that people just get. Thank you so much. Thank you for humouring me as well. I'm going to shoehorn this theme into absolutely everything I do, whether people like it or not. So there we are. Shoehorn one complete. So thank you, chaps. And well, just for me to say, what a joyful conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned all sorts. I feel like I'm going to go and Google hair shirts probably now, if I'm perfectly honest with you.
I tell you what, I cannot wait to get this blooming thing off.
It looks a bit itchy. Okay, so Barbara, what did you think listening to the interview? What are your immediate reflections from Jake and Al's thoughts?
I thought one of the things that came out pretty clearly was a sort of undercurrent of feeling that the water and environment area, advocacy is a bit tentative there in some cases. The thing that I think I've learned in my zillion years of advocating is that if you act as if you've got a right of access to the people you need to influence, somehow they kind of open the door. It's rare for it to be slammed in your face, but you've got to find the right people at the right time. So that was one of the the big lessons that came over for me. But the other one was the one that you've already outlined, the power of storytelling, because you've got to find that delicate blend of evidence and emotion. You can't just have one without the other. I remember one occasion when I was going in to see a minister about kids with long-term conditions not being properly looked after in schools, and it was only when he started to cry because I had two very heart-rending case studies in the flesh with me that I realised I'd won. I'd been giving him lots and lots of evidence and facts and figures for months, but two kids telling heart-rending stories were the thing that did it, and they changed the law the following day, which was brilliant. It's getting that right blend of setting the foundations of evidence and then bringing in the emotional connection so that people really feel that it's something that they can do something about.
When Al talked about the kind of climate science argument, that really resonated for me exactly around that point. All the evidence is there, but it's got to connect with individuals, hasn't it? And then you've just said something really interesting as well, I think, around them being able to feel like they can do something about it. It's a heady combination, I think, isn't it, when you get all that together? So I'm really interested, as you'd imagine, in your experience. You've had a wealth of experiences we've touched on briefly around advocacy across your career. So from your perspective, what are some of those magic ingredients for great advocacy? And have you got any examples of where you've seen that work well? You've just touched on one briefly, but more broadly, are there any within this sector?
I think you need to understand who's advocating for what. So often in advocacy, there's one set of folk on one side and one set of folk on the other. And if you don't understand what the other side are thinking and try to find ways in which you can sign up allies and neutralise the opposition, that's really an important part of it. But the second thing is finding who the guy is with a pen that's going to write the policy paper or write the decision makers' think piece or whatever, because it's often more junior people in government departments, in agencies, in regulators, who are the ones who are crafting the ideas. And if you can find that guy and help him write his paper, that can be a huge way in that would not quite work if you were only going in at the top of that organisation. So finding the right people and getting to know them well and helping them in times of peace, so that when times of war come, you've got an ally at court and they understand where you're coming from and you've done them some favours and it's time for them to do you some favours. That sounds corrupt, but it's the way. It's not corrupt, it's the way the world works. The comments in the interview was about the water industry being tone deaf. I don't think the water industry is tone deaf, to be honest, but I do think that we all fall into the trap of talking to ourselves or talking to each other rather than thinking about who is it I need to influence, what sorts of things will influence them, and how can I get at them in a number of ways, and how can I get other people to get at them that don't. So it's not just me banging on about it, it's other interest groups who would also be prepared to help.
Yeah. And do you think the sector, and when I say the sector, I mean really broadly kind of water and environment, do you think we do that well as a sector from your experience?
I think it's there's always been a real crossover between the kind of pure water activities of the water companies particularly and their environmental delivery, and that's got stronger and stronger over the years as more and more frameworks have come into place. I think our big failure collectively was when I was at the Environment Agency. We had the Water Framework Directive and River Basin Management Plans, which I had this wonderful idea we could make into the alternative planning system in this country by providing a system that actually dealt with the rural areas as well as the urban and development areas. But somehow, somewhere along the line, we didn't quite get that vision shared, and the whole wretched thing fell apart under its own weight, which is a real... When I go to my grave, the Water Framework Directive will be engraved on my heart.
Oh, Barbara. Well, I certainly feel an emotional connection to that. If you're trying to advocate for me to do something, then I'll do it. But that's why it's really refreshing to hear the things that don't work as well, actually, because that's the only way that we get better, isn't it? By looking at what does work, but also what didn't. So maybe that takes us nicely, I guess, on to understand what your kind of messages are to the sector around great advocacy. So, you're a peer in the House of Lords, you're chair of the Woodland Trust. Our audience will be people who work across our sector, and the aim of this pod is to really share the lessons learned and some best practice and learn from experience. What would you like your messages to be?
It's really important that people think about who it is they're trying to influence and try to put advocacy into the terms that they will see as important. With government linking everything to the economy is really important. Linking it to what voters are going to say is really important. And that's much easier these days because, of course, the green recovery arguments have all been laid out. The climate change arguments are really close to voters' hearts, and that's carrying on all the way through COVID and even enhanced. So there's fertile ground out there. But I always used to say there's 3 rules of advocacy. The first one is Woody Allen's statement, 95% of success is turning up. Quite a lot of the time you just got to be in the right place at the right time. You've got to engineer these opportunities. The second one is don't try to do anything between the flash and the bang. The reality is you've got to start early. You've got to get the evidence. You've got to make the contacts. You've got to work the ground so that when you really come for a big push on something, people know who you are. They know that you're trustworthy, that you're reliable, you're evidence-based, and they know that they can work with you. And the third one is knowing what you want and asking for it. The number of times I've been lobbied by people who are wringing their hands over a particular issue, and then when you say, well, what do you want me to do? They go, and don't know. So being very, very clear, keeping it simple, keeping it relevant, and keeping it emotional at the end of the day. But above all, it's got to be evidence-based. If anybody ever gets you fiddling the books, fiddling the numbers, you will have lost their trust.
And for me, that's where the power of organisations like CIWEM are really strong, that view of being really evidence-led. And whilst I appreciate I'm talking to a peer, being quite apolitical as an organisation and making sure that we just follow the science is really important, isn't it?
And you've got a huge wealth with all of the practitioners who are in CIWEM because they know stuff that other people don't know. And finding ways to get that stuff presented in a factual but charismatic way is just pure gold.
And I should mention, actually, as a conflict of interest, Barbara is an honorary fellow of CIWEM, which is wonderful. So we are delighted that you are within our ranks, really. Barbara, that's fascinating. Thank you so much. Time has flown by, and I think we're probably at the end of our first episode of Let's Talk WEM. But before we go, there is a little thing that I am hoping to, engineer into every episode, really. As I mentioned before, the theme of my presidency is everything is connected. I thought we'd see if we could try and find a path between this episode around advocacy and my next episode, sort of 6 degrees of separation style. So, Barbara, my next topic is flooding. I'll be speaking to Doncaster Council and the Environment Agency about how they work together during and post the winter floods in 2019. So, any links?
Well, certainly there was a link in the actual interview and the podcast discussion because I used to be burnt in effigy on the Somerset levels for having created flooding, and now, of course, reflooding the Somerset levels is regarded as a jolly fine thing in terms of stemming the flow and creating biodiversity. But my abiding memory will be when I was at the Environment Agency in a rowing boat with Ed Miliband going across the floods to one of his stranded communities in Doncaster. So how's that for a link?
I couldn't have asked for better, really, could I? Thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you to you for listening to our first episode of Let's Talk WEM. I hope you've really enjoyed it. I hope you've taken a few learning points away. I certainly have. Join us for our next episode out in January, where I'll be interviewing Oliver Harmer, the Regional Director of the Environment Agency, and Damien Allen, who's the Chief Executive of Doncaster Council. And my guest co-host then, joining me from Aotearoa, New Zealand, is Liam Foster. Finally, a ginormous thank you to Barbara, Baroness Young of Old Scone, for being my first ever guest co-host. How was it for you?
It was wonderful. I learned a lot as well.
Thanks so much, Barbara. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
Let's Talk WEM is produced by Bwlb. Bwlb Bwlb. The best ideas, the strongest content.